Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to do a quick thing today about kind of what my book is talking about and what China's Great Migration is. I put these numbers together just to give a sense of what exactly happened in China's Great Migration. In 1982, there were about 200 million people, 209 million people living in Chinese cities. The rest of the 1.1 billion Chinese were living in the countryside, often on subsistence levels, farming on small farms. By 2005, this number had gotten up to about 550 million, on its way to 778 million today. By 2025, we're expected to get to about 1 billion urban dwellers in China. And to put this in comparison, in 1982, there were about 231 million people in the United States. In 2005, the population of China got around to the population of the entirety of North America. And by 2025, the urban population of China is expected to be about the same as the entire Western Hemisphere. To put this in context another way, in 2012, there were 260 million migrant workers in China. This is about 20 times as many as the number of Europeans making use of the single labor market in Europe. There's 41 million immigrants in the United States, and this number is larger than, in fact, the entirety of all international immigrants in the world. So when I wrote this book, I wanted to find out what happens when you take 500 million people, or you take, I guess in this case, 290 million people, and move them from the countryside to the cities. Originally, China, when it came out of the Cultural Revolution, it was an extremely segregated labor market. You weren't legally allowed to move from your job in the countryside to the cities. You were given your job essentially at birth because it was all linked to who you were born with, where you were born. And over the course of about 20 years, this extremely segmented labor market turned into a more or less unified labor market with some constraints that are still existing. And how did this happen? First of all, during the Maoist era, there was a lot of forced deurbanization. The most famous one, which is one of the ones I talk about in the book, is the sent-down youth, which were about 17 million children who were either the children, they were teenagers who were either the children of class enemies, people who had fallen out of political favor, or just people that they couldn't afford to keep in cities because they couldn't provide them with employment. And they were sent down to the countryside to see the life of the rural workers, learn more about the greatness of communism, and almost all of them, as soon as they got there, immediately wanted to leave. And were not allowed to until the Maoist system fell apart. But there was a lot of other things that happened before that. There was, early on in the communist era, they paid people to go out to the countryside so they didn't have to take care of them in the cities. Eventually they started deporting people. They started feeding people with ration cards as opposed to allowing a full market for food, which made it hard for people who weren't in an urban work group to get food. They did the same with housing. And then eventually what happened was in the 1960s, they put in place a law a bit earlier, they put in place a law to kind of register where people are located, and then they started forcibly enforcing that law in 1960 during the Great Leap Forward, when they did not have enough food to feed their population. And people who were sent back to the countryside were supposed to be self-sufficient, which in many cases meant that they died. When Mao died, the Cultural Revolution ended. Government capacity had been gutted by the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was essentially a civil war within the Communist Party. And a lot of the mechanisms they used to control lower level politicians or low level enforcement mechanisms had fallen apart. And one of the first things that happened was all 17 million sent-down youth came back to the city, and they all started asking for jobs. According to communist doctrine, at that time, full employment was guaranteed by the state. And when they couldn't provide full employment for these 17 million youth, they said that it would be okay for them to employ themselves, which was the first situation of private employment after the communists took over, and kind of started the kind of snowballing effect of more private enterprises meant more competition with state-owned enterprises, which meant more difficulty maintaining state-owned enterprises, which meant more places where the state retreated and the private sector jumped in. On top of this, there was efforts to reform agriculture. The agricultural system had been run by communes, which were not particularly effective. As they reformed them, they had more land could be taken care of by less people, and then those people who were left over started looking for other places where they could find work. And then finally, what happened was the Chinese government has never been particularly good at maintaining its tax revenues. So as finances started collapsing because they had a very communist-y tax system, and then as private sector came in, they weren't able to tax it as efficiently as they were able to tax state-owned enterprises, which were literally owned by the state and were producing according to plan, and they knew exactly how much profits they were going to make because prices were controlled. And as they started having to deal with market-based taxation, all of the social services that they provided that were based on where you lived started collapsing. So originally, foods were provided by ration cards. That collapsed fairly early on. Housing was owned by state-owned enterprises. They privatized that in the 1980s. In the 1990s, a number of state-owned enterprises went bankrupt, which opened up more of the market for private sector. And then another thing that happened was a lot of social services that they were providing, because they didn't have enough money to provide them, they were providing them at a local level, but because they didn't have enough money to provide them, the local governments stopped providing good social services like schooling and healthcare, and that made the incentive to stay places where you could get social services very small. So people started ignoring these restrictions on migration and migrating despite that. The second thing that happened because of government budget constraints was the government started depending on urban construction for income because of a tax reform and land seizures. I posted on Twitter today about 70% of industrial zones in China make use of illegally seized land. There is a legal pathway for, the way that this works is so they have a legal separation between rural land and urban land. And the way that this works is in order for to convert rural land to urban land, the state has to do that. In order for the state to do it, they have to purchase the rural land and then convert it and then sell it as urban land. The trick here is rural land is, the price for rural land is based on the price of crops grown on it, whereas the price for urban land is based on the market. So they make a sizable chunk of change from taking this rural land for very cheap, transforming to urban land, and then selling it for 4 to 5 to 6 times as much as it originally cost. So the combined effect of all these things were people who were living in the countryside. Some of them, the hard restrictions keeping them from going to the countryside collapsed at the Cultural Revolution. And then a number of soft restrictions fell apart after that as the government was no longer able to fund social services, and the government depended increasingly on urbanization to pad its budgets. This led to the creation of a mostly unified land market or labor market. So what happened? Once you had a unified labor market, the general estimate in the accounting literature that I came across was somewhere around 20% of all growth economic growth in China came from just taking people out of the countryside and putting them into industrial jobs. So this is an extremely simple way of calculating it, but it leads to the eye-popping number that something on the course of $1 trillion in GDP was created between 1990 and 2010, just from the simple fact of grabbing someone from one pile of laborers and putting them into another pile of laborers. The natural question here is why were they able to find these industrial jobs? And as I kind of go through in the book, a lot of these industrial jobs came about because there were people there to do the jobs. A lot of them were China still doesn't have a very functional capital market, and a lot of the industries that they were entering into were industries that could expand if they had workers to expand these industries, things like textiles, and eventually things like plastics and electronics manufacturing. Second, these people all needed places to live. There's the Chinese housing market is quite weird, but at one point, urban construction accounted for about 1/3 of Chinese GDP. This wasn't all for migration. A good part of it was upgrading old housing stock, but the general sense of the matter is, if there wasn't all of these people coming to the city, there's a sizable amount of urban construction that wouldn't have happened, and that added yet more to GDP. The third main thing that migration adds to an economy is cluster effects. These are like innovation centers, things like the Silicon Valley, where engineers get together and build new and crazy things. When we think about innovation like we think about it in the Silicon Valley, where it's a lot of investing in R&D, it's a lot of creating new high-tech gadgets, China doesn't seem to do a lot of it. When you think about migration in terms of the utilization of labor, China does a ton of it. And there's two things that kind of go on. One is when you have a lot of people put in the same place, they can do things that a small number of people can't do. And the example I use is the Foxconn factory that makes iPhones, which employs somewhere in the realm of 300 to 400,000 people. Now, is it possible to build iPhones with less than 300,000 to 400,000 people? Yes, but they would be more expensive. It would be less flexible as it terms to getting new speculations at the last minute, getting new things added at the last minute. And it's worth thinking just exactly how hard it is to get 300 to 400,000 people working for you. The average estimate you find when you're looking at kind of how Chinese factories works is 20% turnover every year. So that's about 20% of the 300,000, 400,000 people quit every year. On top of that, they all had to be hired within the course of about 1 or 2 years. This required the factory to put up hiring booths across the entire province, which is a province of about 100 million people. They set, the government was helping them because it was part of the investment deal, and they set hiring targets for all of these places across the province. They only have 3 requirements for working there. One is no tattoos, another is you're over 18 years old, the third is you can never have been fired from Foxconn before. And if you meet those 3 requirements, you are hired. And I've been to these hiring events. They are literally, do you meet the 3 requirements? Get in the bus. And even with those kind of simple standards, 100 million person labor pool, wages in the province rose by 50%. When I got there, they were being paid about 1,300 yuan a month, which is in the realm of $200. No, before I got there, they were being paid that. They said, when I got there, they said they were being paid about 2,100, which is about $300. So the second thing is cost innovation and competition. If I am Elon Musk and I want to build the newest, coolest electric car, I'm going to need a ton of capital for that. If I don't have access to a ton of capital, I'm depending on a ton of labor for my job, which happens in a lot of these businesses in China. All I need is to hire more people, and that's something that anyone can do. So what ends up happening is you get a lot of people entering into one industry, margins go down to bare bone margins, and people start innovating on ways to keep costs down. And particularly as in this case, because there's a lot of competition for the best employees, wages have been going up in China, and this leads to more competition for how to bring down the cost of things. You can see this in so the point I talk about in the book is BYD, which is got famous a few years back because Warren Buffett invested a bunch of money in this car company. This company started out as a battery company, and it basically took the models of Sanyo batteries from Japan, replaced all of their machines with labor, and sold it for about 20 to 30% cheaper. And another example I talk about in the book is JNBY, which I find thrilling. But JNBY, so there's tons of competition in the clothing markets in China, or the textile markets in China, because it makes up something like a third of the entirety of the world's textile production. And JNBY, which now has a store in Seattle and Vancouver, their business model is, instead of hiring as many laborers as they can, they hire as many designers as they possibly can. So they get these kids straight out of design school, have them throw out as many designs as they plausibly can, and throw them on the rack. So when you get there, you get relatively cheap clothes, but none of the clothes in the store are the same. They're all new designs that cycle through every few weeks or every month. So politically, how did this shape China? Other than the just kind of straight growth things. First thing is, China's leaders have consistently said that migration is their #1 issue. This was most famously said by Hu Jintao, which George W. Bush told Hu Jintao that he was kept up by the thought of another terrorist attack, and asked him what kept him up at night, and Hu Jintao said the thought of creating 25 million jobs a day. If you look at kind of the history of how Chinese reforms happen, a lot of they look less like the plans of brilliant government policymakers, and more just kind of a frantic effort to keep up with what's going on in the labor market. And this has happened particularly in the kind of expansion of private enterprises, but you'll see this particularly when you're looking at things like the fiscal system, which has been a consistent problem for the Chinese government. One of the things I was trying to answer when I wrote this book is, so I came at China from a background in financial journalism, and I thought I was going to be able to write about financial journalism like I did in the Czech Republic. And China's financial system does not work in any way remotely how Westerners imagine a financial system to work. The financial system is controlled more or less by 4 state-owned banks. These state-owned banks make up the majority of all assets traded in the system. Every time that there have been an effort to reform the systems, to expand into stocks, bonds, private banking, it's always fallen up against the barrier that these state-owned banks lend a lot to state-owned enterprises, and these state-owned enterprises take a very long time to pay back their loans, if they pay them back at all. So the Chinese government wants to give clearance for these state-owned enterprises to kind of invest in things in long time horizons, things like infrastructure. But in order to do that, they need to prevent money from leaving the system in order to chase a better return. And so they block all forms of financial innovation. I mean, there's a push-pull factor, but it's generally been more pull than push. And when you start to think about, and then you see these projects in China that just have just gigantic amounts of waste, and when you start to try to figure out how China works and how it's grown and how it's brought 753 million people out of poverty, you want to reach for this idea of there's job creators creating jobs, and there's kind of efficient capital markets, and there's money to be made because someone did something clever. And then when you get there, you see that this is just not happening. When you look at migration as just a sheer kind of numbers of people kind of being thrown into the industrial sector, that has created an enormous amount of growth, and it has allowed them to grow out of a lot of these problems. The big ones being the financial system does not work very well. That has created non-performing loans. About 20 years ago, the entire financial system had to be bailed out. There's a not small chance that it's going to have to happen again. But when you're growing at 10% a year, non-performing loans shrink at 10% a year. Second thing is it has a really dysfunctional fiscal system, and this kind of goes into urban construction has been a major source of the finances for the government, for the local government. Local government is mostly paid for by turnover taxes on urban construction, and makes a lot of money off of land seizures. And also, they provide extremely weak social services, in part because they have to continue paying for the risk that's in their financial system, the risk that's in various other parts of their government debt. And they've shored up a lot of these problems. And they're also just not very good at collecting taxes. Something like 20 to 30% of GDP comes from taxes, which is low compared to most other countries. this has allowed them to kind of grow out of it and solve some problems. This last thing is it forced China into an extremely specific part of the supply chain. Because they don't have very functional capital markets, they don't do things like make iPhones. They don't have the ability to invest in R&D. They don't have the ability to invest in kind of branding. What they have done traditionally is they make use of their large quantities of labor to innovate ways to do things cheaply while depending on people from other countries to do branding and R&D development. This has led to their bad IP enforcement regime. This has led to, but it also kind of gives you a different way to think about their economy in the sense that they can build things like not just cheap iPhones, but they can build kind of very strange smartphone products that are different from what you see built in the rest of the world because they're doing them cheaply, making use of the flexibility of having a large amount of labor as opposed to large capital investments that need planning ahead of time. And I've talked about this a few times already. This is my absolute favorite stat from the book. Between 1990 and 2011, China's share of global clothing exports grew from 9 to 37%. Product development cycles in the clothing industry fell from 6 to 9 months to 4 to 6 weeks. And I think that just sums up kind of what a very kind of labor-centric economic model looks like, and how China has kind of thought about their business models. It's been anything that has a low barrier to entry capital-wise, they just throw a ton of people on it and have been able to dominate world markets in these ways. This has given them the ability to, in these sectors, be extremely flexible because, again, they're not programming machines to do these things. What they're doing is they're talking to people and saying, "Hey, let's try something new. Let's change this." Or I got a call from our contract person in America and they want something changed right away. Let's change this right away. And it allows them to kind of jump around and produce new products much faster than the world had traditionally been used to. And I've already slightly talked about BYD and JNBY. BYD made cheap cell phone batteries by replacing machines with labor, and JNBY. And this was kind of an example of how China has been upgrading as opposed to doing the labor side cheaper. They've started moving into doing the design side cheaper. This is a JNBY showroom. As you can see, none of those two objects are the same, though some of them work along similar patterns. So there's two things I wanted to kind of get at with my book. One was what China can tell us about migration and what migration can tell us about China. I've talked a lot about what China can tell us, migration can tell us about China, but kind of from a not Chinese specialist point of view, what China can tell us about migration is the real kind of kicker. So when I started looking into this, the more I started looking into this, the more I thought the differences between what happened in China in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000s, and what happened in the European Union in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s was not stark, except in the sense that China's was a much larger situation. These were still very segregated labor markets prior to China opening up and prior to European Union opening up. And the major difference between kind of what happened in China and what happened elsewhere in the world when we're dealing with migrants is they were all Chinese people, which might be a big deal, it might not be, but it can tell us about other things that might happen if you got a large wave of migrants coming to your shores all at one time. So the big thing that I've seen in the China experience was that the division of labor matters more than the supply and demand of labor. So we're used to hearing on the news, if a bunch of workers come to a location, then naturally the wages for workers are going to go down because there's more competition for jobs and the employers can pay less. That's like, I've heard that said that that's basic economics. And what I always imagine the response to be is, basic economics is what Adam Smith talked about in The Wealth of Nations, which is when you have more people, you have more abilities to divide the labor market up and divide a job up, which allows you more efficiencies of scale, and it allows you to create products that couldn't have otherwise been created. And the example here being, again, the iPhone, which is made by 300 to 400,000 people in Zhengzhou, China, which would be a Herculean task of hiring if it was anywhere else. And this comes out regularly in the literature about kind of how immigration works. Is we don't see very much of an impact from migration on wages. And it's very clear in the case of China that wages actually went up because of migration, because it allowed more opportunities for people to specialize and to build products that couldn't have otherwise been built. On the other side, migration is a substantial and real political problem. The fact that Chinese migrants were all Chinese, and yet the Chinese government still found them to be their largest political problem, should tell you that the problem isn't just kind of whatever prejudice there is in the society. The problem is things like they're coming to places which need to have housing, need to have roads, need to have public transportation, need to have water, need to have sewage, need to have schools, hospitals, pensions, health insurance. And people think that these things have been built for them. And then when you have a large influx of new people and large population growth, they think that there's a larger group of people after the same pie. And that leads to smaller distributions to everyone. If the pie does not grow, if there's no mechanisms in place to make it so all of these government services are responsive to population growth, then it will cause real and probably legitimate tensions. And so the question for kind of governments who are dealing with these problems shouldn't be whether migrants are good for the economy or whether they're good for the poor in the economy. The data shows quite strongly that they tend to be quite good for the economy. The question for policymakers who are dealing with these problems is how can we make the policy atmosphere more responsive to migrants or more responsive to population growth in general. And this doesn't just affect international migrants, as we've been talking about recently in Europe and America. It affects people coming from the middle of the country to the cities. It affects people coming who live in those regions but want to move out of their parents' house. It affects people who kind of want to kind of form new households in places where economic activity is the strongest. And coming from the Silicon Valley, I think this speaks to all of us here. And now the kind of big, what migration tells us about the future of China. Migration will probably, the Great Migration is expected to end sometime in the next 10 years, or at least fade out by 2030. The real estate contribution to growth has pretty much already ended. That's why growth in China has fallen from 10% to 6%, is because there's no longer the big real estate boom that there once was. As growth slows from 10 to 8 to 6 to 4 to 2%, that means things like government debt, that means things like banking sector non-performing loans are going to become much bigger problems than they once were, and that China needs to be able to respond to them. China has a bunch of advantages in place. They've built up the largest industrial base in the history of the world. They have the largest labor market in the world. They have low social services payments because they've not really created a welfare state that works in any sense of the word. They have, I've read that China's expected to pass up America as the largest consumer market any day now. All of those things speak to China's advantages in transitioning from an economy that is dependent on mobilizing large quantities of labor and getting them into the factories to one that looks more like what we see all around us here, people who are trying to get efficient capital markets, people who are trying to serve to a local customer base, people who are trying to create new products efficiently and utilize capital efficiently. But the government, there's still a number of problems in the Chinese economy. And while they seem to be aware particularly of the issues in the financial and the fiscal system, the solutions that kind of come to everyone in mind, which is privatizing state-owned enterprises, getting the government out of the industrial sector, it's not clear that the Chinese government is willing to do any of those things. The Chinese government seems to be firmly committed to having a strong role for the state in the economy and having that role be directly through state-owned enterprises. And as long as that happens, financial reforms are not going to go well, and fiscal reforms seem like they're going to be halting. So they have an opportunity to make this change. There's still a solid cushion for them to land on, but it's unclear whether they're going to want to. And I'm ending with a picture of, these are help wanted signs in Zhengzhou. And if you wander around China and see these plastered on a wall, which if you go to factory towns in China, they're plastered everywhere, that's kind of how I feel kind of the Great Migration looks like on the ground floor. Thank you.